Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt of the Garrett Creek ranch yard and said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say. She said it not to the woman on the porch, whose face was a road map of hardship and suspicion, but to the wind that bit at her cheeks, a wind that smelled of pine and dust and the end of the line. She had walked the last 7 miles, her son Samuel's small hand a hot, trusting weight in her own. He was a silent boy, had been for the 6 months since his father's funeral, and the subsequent loss of their own small holding. The silence was a stone in Cora's heart, heavier than the bags at her feet. Clear as throat, the woman on the porch was Edna Garrett. She held a rifle, not aimed, but held with the casual familiarity of a limb. Her eyes were the gray of creek stones after a hard rain. She was not old, but she was weathered, worn down, not by years, but by the constant, grinding pressure of holding this place together on her own. She looked at Cora, the boy, at the threadbare respectability of Cora's dress. She had seen this kind of desperation before. It usually came with a plea, with tears, with a story designed to wring pity from a stone. It was a currency she no longer traded in. "We're not hiring," Edna said. Her voice was flat, without malice, a statement of fact as unyielding as the mountains that loomed behind her. Cora looked up from the dust. She did not plead. She did not offer her story. Of widowhood and foreclosure, of a life whittled down to 2 bags and a silent child. She looked at the peeling paint on the porch rail, the sag in the roof of the main house, the way one of the corral fences listed like a drunk. She saw a place as tired as she was. Not lazy, not beaten, just running on a kind of stubborn momentum that was bound to fail. "I can see that," Cora said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "You're not hiring because you can't afford to, but you can't afford not to, either." This was not the script Edna expected. She shifted the rifle's weight. "And what is it you think you know about my finances, woman?" "I know what a struggling ranch looks like," Cora answered. She gestured with her chin toward the corral. "That fence post has been rotten for a year. Your tack in the lean-to is dry and cracking. The smoke from your chimney is thin, means you're burning green wood, or not enough of it. Your men, what few I saw, look lean and tired. You're feeding them beans and biscuits, and not enough of either." She paused, her gaze steady. "I know you need a cook, a real one, and a mender. And someone to keep your books, because I'd wager they're a mess, too." A flicker of something, annoyance, or maybe a grudging respect, crossed Edna's face. Before she could answer, a shout came from the direction of the barn. A young hand, no more than 18, came running, his face pale with panic. "Mr. Jed, it's the mare, the gray one. She's down in the creek bed, tangled in wire." Just then, a man with a heavy brow and a permanent scowl, Jed, the foreman, stormed out of the barn. And he was wiping grease from his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "What in blazes is it now, Leo?" "The mare. She got loose. She's cut up bad," Leo stammered. Without a word, Edna was off the porch, the rifle left leaning against the post. She moved with a long, ground-eating stride. Jed was right behind her. Curiosity and a deeper instinct pulled Cora along too, dragging Samuel with her. They reached the edge of the creek bed. It was steep, the bank eroded from the spring thaw. Down below, a fine gray mare, her coat slick with sweat and mud, was thrashing wildly. An old length of barbed wire, discarded and half-buried, was wrapped around her back leg. With every panic movement, she was slicing herself deeper. "Hold her head, Leo," Jed bellowed, starting to slide down the bank. "Damn fool horse. She's going to break her leg." Edna's voice was tight with a pain that was more than just financial. She loved her animals. That much was clear. Jed reached the mare and tried to get a hand on the wire, but the horse kicked out, her eyes rolling white with terror. He scrambled back, cursing. "Can't get near it. She's going to have to be put down." "No," Edna said, the word a flat, hard stone. Cora watched for a moment. She saw the panic of the men, the fear of the horse, the sharp reality of the wire. She saw a problem that muscle and shouting wouldn't solve. She let go of Samuel's hand. "Stay here," she whispered. her voice a low command. He had learned to obey without question. She started down the bank, her movements careful and deliberate on the loose scree. "Get back, woman," Jed snarled, seeing her approach. "You'll get yourself killed." Cora ignored him. She stopped about 10 feet from the mare. She did not look at the wound. She did not look at the wire. She looked at the horse's eye. She began to speak, her voice a low, soothing murmur. Not words so much as a sound, a hum that was the opposite of the men's frantic shouts. It was the sound of calm. "Easy now," she crooned. "Easy, girl, it's all right. Just a little trouble. We'll get you out of it. Just be still now. Be still." The mare's frantic thrashing lessened. Her ears twitched, flicking toward the sound of Cora's voice. She was still trembling, her breath coming in great shuddering gasps. But the wild, self-destructive panic began to subside. Cess. Cora took another slow step forward, still humming, her hands held out, palms open and empty. "Give me your knife," she said to Jed, her eyes never leaving the horse. He hesitated, then grunted and passed it over. "Handle first, and your belt," she said to Leo, who was staring, mesmerized. The boy fumbled with his buckle and handed it to her. Cora moved to the horse's head, still murmuring. She stroked the mare's nose, then her forehead, her touch infinitely gentle. The horse blew out a long breath and stood trembling, but still. With one hand still on the mare's head, Cora used the other to work the leather belt around her muzzle, fashioning a makeshift gentle hackamore. She handed the end to Leo. "Just hold her steady. Don't pull." Then she moved to the rear leg. The mare flinched but did not kick. Cora knelt in the mud and cold creek water, her skirt soaking through. Instantly, she examined the wire. It was a nasty tangle embedded deep. Pulling it would only make it worse. She used the tip of Jed's knife, not to cut the wire, but to carefully, painstakingly, unhook the barbs from the horse's flesh, one by one, working against the direction of the tangle. Her fingers were deft and sure. It took long, agonizing minutes. The men watched in silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the last barb was free. She unwrapped the loosened wire and tossed it far up the bank. Only then did she look at the wound. It was ugly but clean. "She'll need stitches and a poultice. Do you have linseed?" "And carbolic?" Edna, who had been watching from the top of the bank, with an unreadable expression, finally spoke. "We do." Cora nodded. She patted the mare's flank gently. "She'll be all right. She's strong." She stood up, her skirt dripping, her hands covered in mud and a little blood. She looked at Edna, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear. "I'll cook and clean," Cora said, her voice still quiet but now carrying the weight of proven worth. "I'll mend your tack and your clothes. I'll tend your sick animals. I'll keep your books. You give me and my boy a roof and 3 meals a day. For 1 week. At the end of the week, if you don't think I'm worth that, we'll leave. No hard feelings." Edna Garrett looked from the now calm horse to the quiet woman standing in the creek. She looked at the foreman, Jed, who was staring at his knife in Cora's hand, as if he'd never seen it before. She looked at the young hand, Leo, who was gazing at Cora with something approaching awe. Finally, her eyes settled on the small, silent boy, who hadn't moved a muscle from the spot where his mother had left him. She had come here expecting to turn away another piece of driftwood. What she had gotten was a demonstration, a quiet, undeniable display of competence, under pressure. Edna was a woman who understood value, and she had just witnessed it raw. "Clear as throat. The cookhouse is behind the main house," Edna said, turning to walk away. "The room in the back is empty. It's small." She paused. "Supper is in 3 hours. There are 4 hands and me." It was not a welcome. It was not an acceptance. It was a provisional offer, as cold and hard as the ground they stood on. For Cora Halloran, it was enough. It was everything. The cookhouse was less a building and more a monument to neglect. A film of grease coated every surface, the ghost of 1,000 hasty, joyless meals. The air was thick with the smell of old bacon fat and stale coffee. The stove was a hulking iron beast, its surface rusted in patches. A stack of dirty plates sat in a basin of scummy water. It was a place that declared, in no uncertain terms, that food was fuel and nothing more. Cora took it all in, without a change in expression. Despair was a luxury she had discarded months ago. She found a relatively clean rag, located the lye soap under the sink, and began. She did not attack the room with frantic energy. Her work was methodical, a quiet campaign against chaos. She started with the water. She hauled buckets from the pump, her arms aching from the walk and the weight of her bags, and set them on the stove to heat. While the water warmed, she swept the floor, her broom strokes even and sure, collecting dust and debris into a neat pile. Samuel stood in the doorway, a small, silent sentinel. He watched his mother work, his dark eyes taking everything in. He had seen her do this before, in other, temporary places. This was how she made a space safe. She did not talk about it. She imposed order with her hands, with soap and water, with the steady rhythm of her labor. It was her language, and he understood it perfectly. Once the water was hot, the real work began. She scoured the stovetop with sand and lye until the rust gave way to dull, clean iron. She scrubbed the pots and pans until they shone, her knuckles raw. She washed every plate, every fork, every cup, and stacked them to dry. With each clean surface, the oppressive atmosphere of the room lifted, inch by inch. The air began to smell of soap and hot metal instead of rancid fat. She worked without stopping, her movements economical, born of a life where wasted energy was a form of sin. This was not a performance for Edna Garrett or the hands. It was an expression of her very nature. Her late husband, a man of quiet ways and deep knowledge of the land, had always said that Cora could bring order to a whirlwind. She had managed their farm, kept their books, birthed their calves, and made a home out of a drafty cabin and a patch of stubborn dirt. Competence was not a skill she had learned. It was the bedrock of her soul. Losing the farm had not taken that from her. It had only honed it to a finer edge. With the kitchen passably clean, she turned her attention to supper. The larder was as bleak as she had predicted. A half-empty sack of flour, a barrel of pinto beans, a slab of salt pork, onions, potatoes, and coffee beans that looked and smelled burnt. It was the diet of men who were being sustained, not nourished. But to Cora, it was a puzzle, and she knew how to solve it. She set the beans to soak. She rendered a small piece of the salt pork, the hiss and pop, a welcome sound in the quiet room. In the hot fat, she sautéed a chopped onion until it was soft and sweet. She built her stew from there, adding the potatoes, a bay leaf she found in a dusty tin, and a precious few dried herbs from a small pouch in her own bag. It was her one small indulgence, a reminder of her garden. While the stew simmered, she made biscuits. Her hands, red and chapped from the lye, moved with a dancer's grace through the flour. She did not measure. She knew the feel of the dough, the exact moment it came together, soft and pliable but not sticky. She worked it gently, folded it over on itself, her touch light. The men who would eat these biscuits would never know the care that went into them, the years of practice, the muscle memory that lived in her fingertips. They would only know that they were good. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard, the smells drifting from the cookhouse began to work their magic. It was a scent the Garrett Creek Ranch hadn't known in a long time, not just food, but cooking. Mar, the rich, savory aroma of the stew, the warm, yeasty promise of baking biscuits, the clean, sharp fragrance of freshly brewed coffee, made from beans she had carefully sorted to remove the worst of the burnt ones. The first to arrive was Leo, the young hand. He paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes wide. The room was transformed. It was clean. It was warm. It smelled like a home. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice hesitant. "Supper's ready," Cora said, not turning from the stove. "Wash up at the pump." He nodded and fled, returning minutes later with two other hands, their faces scrubbed clean. They were older, more grizzled, and their skepticism was a palpable force in the room. They took their usual seats at the long, scarred table, their movements stiff and uncertain in the unfamiliar cleanliness. Jed, the foreman, was the last to arrive, followed by Edna. Jed's scowl deepened as he took in the scene. Edna's face remained a careful mask, but her eyes missed nothing. The gleaming stove, the neatly stacked plates, the boy Samuel sitting on a small stool in the corner, whittling a piece of wood Leo had given him. Cora served the meal without ceremony. She ladled the thick stew into bowls and placed a basket of steaming, golden-topped biscuits in the center of the table. The men hesitated, then fell to eating. For a long moment, the only sounds were the scraping of spoons against bowls and the quiet chewing. The stew was simple, but it was rich and deeply flavorful. The potatoes were tender, the beans creamy, the small bits of salt pork adding a smoky depth. But it was the biscuits that broke them. They were magnificent, fluffy, layered with a crisp, buttery crust and a tender crumb. One of the older hands, a man named Hap who rarely spoke, took a bite, closed his eyes for a second, and then took another. He did not look at Cora, but he reached for a second biscuit. It was a review more eloquent than a page of praise. Jed ate with a kind of grudging intensity. He cleaned his bowl, wiping it with a piece of biscuit, but his expression remained sour. He was a man who resisted change on principle, and this clean room and good food were a profound change. Edna ate slowly, thoughtfully. She tasted the stew, broke open a biscuit. She looked at her men. She saw the tension ease from their shoulders, saw the deep satisfaction on their faces. They were not just eating, they were being cared for. It was a distinction she had forgotten was possible. She was a practical woman. She knew that well-fed men worked harder. They complained less. They stayed longer. The meal was a direct, tangible improvement to her ranch. After the meal, the men scraped their plates clean, a new development, and left them in the wash basin as Cora instructed. They left quietly, with mumbled thanks, except for Jed, who said nothing. Leo lingered for a moment at the door. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, looking at Cora. That was the best meal I've had in a year." He glanced at Samuel in the corner and gave a small, shy smile before disappearing into the dusk. Cora began to clear the table. Edna remained in her seat. The two women were alone in the warm, clean room, the silence broken only by the clatter of dishes. "The mare is resting easy," Edna said. It was not praise, but it was information. A report between colleagues. "The stitches are holding. The poultice seems to be helping." "She's a good horse," Cora replied, her back to Edna as she pumped water into the wash basin. She just needed a calm hand. Edna watched her. She saw the straightness of her back, the weariness that was evident in the slight slump of her shoulders now that she thought no one was watching. She saw a woman who was running on fumes, but whose every action was purposeful. "My husband used to say, there were two kinds of people," Edna said, her voice quiet. "Those who see a problem and talk about it, and those who see a problem and fix it." She stood up. "The room in the back. There's a cot for you, and a pallet for the boy. There are extra blankets in the chest." She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the frame. She looked back at Cora, who had finally stopped moving and was just standing, her hands braced on the edge of the sink. "Breakfast is at sunrise," Edna said. Then she was gone. Cora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had survived the first day. She looked over at her son. Samuel had finished his carving. It was a small, rough horse. He held it out to her. She crossed the room, knelt down, and took it from him. His fingers were warm. She looked at the little wooden horse, then at her son's face. He offered her a small, fleeting smile. It was the first one she had seen in months. In the quiet warmth of the cookhouse, surrounded by the smell of clean surfaces and the lingering scent of good food, Cora felt a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of something that felt almost like hope. The week stretched before her, a mountain to climb. But for the first time in a long time, she felt she had solid ground beneath her feet. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by work and weather. Cora rose before the sun, the cold of the small room biting at her skin. Her first act was always to light the stove, a daily battle against the hulking iron beast that she was slowly winning. The fire she built was not just for cooking. It was the first assertion of order against the cold chaos of the night. It was a beacon. Breakfast was no longer a grim affair of burnt coffee and hardtack. Cora made oatmeal, thick and creamy, with a swirl of molasses if she could spare it. She baked Johnny cakes or fried potatoes with onions. The coffee was strong and clean. The men started their day with warmth in their bellies, and it made a difference. Tempers were shorter, and the morning's work began with a steady purpose. Instead of a sullen groan, Leo, the young hand, was her first and most open ally. He made it a point to compliment every meal. He started bringing her small offerings, a handful of wild raspberries he'd found near the creek, a bird's nest with 2 perfect pale blue eggs that had fallen from a tree. He would present them to Samuel, who would accept them with his customary silence, but his eyes would light up. The two of them, the lanky, earnest young man and the small, silent boy, formed a quiet friendship in the spaces between chores. Hap, the quiet veteran, remained a man of few words, but his approval was unmistakable. He began taking his second cup of coffee in the cookhouse after breakfast, just sitting at the table while Cora cleaned, watching her work with a placid, contemplative air. One morning he looked at a tear in her apron. "My wife. She had a sewing box. In the bunkhouse. Top of my locker. Might be some good thread in there." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make. The thread, when she found it, was strong and waxed, far better than her own dwindling supply. It was a gift of profound respect. Jed, however, remained a bastion of resistance. The better the food, the cleaner the kitchen, the more his resentment seemed to fester. He was a man whose authority was rooted in the old way of doing things, in a harsh, masculine world where comfort was weakness. Cora, with her quiet competence and the subtle changes she wrought, was a threat to that world. He never complained about the food directly. It was too obviously good for that. Instead, his complaints were oblique, aimed at her presence. "Place is starting to smell like a damn perfumery," he grumbled one evening, though the only scent was of roasting chicken and rosemary she'd found growing wild. Another time he watched her, showing Samuel how to shell peas. Shouldn't that boy be out doing boy's work? Not sitting in a kitchen like a girl? Cora didn't rise to the bait. "He's 6, Jed. He's shelling peas. It's useful work." The simmering conflict came to a head on the 5th day of her trial week. It was a small thing, as it often is. Cora had used the last of the flour for the morning's bread. She had made a note of it on the supply list. She'd started keeping on a piece of slate by the door. She needed Jed to bring a new sack from the main storage barn on his way back from the far pasture. The men came in for supper, hungry and tired. Cora had a pot of bean soup simmering, rich with ham hock, but she had no bread to serve with it. Jed stomped in, tossing his hat on a peg. "Where's the bread?" he demanded, his voice loud in the small room. "There is no bread," Cora said calmly, ladling soup into bowls. "We're out of flour." It was on the list. Jed's face darkened. "You're the cook. It's your job to make sure there's flour. What have you been doing all day, polishing the damn spoons?" The other men at the table fell silent, looking down at their soup. Leo looked from Jed to Cora, his expression worried. Hap stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. Cora placed a bowl of soup in front of Jed. She did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger. She met his glare with a look of placid steel. "My job is to cook what's provided. I cannot cook with flour that is not in this kitchen. I put it on the list this morning. You are the foreman. It is your job to see to the supplies." "I've got more important things to do than haul your baking supplies around," he sneered. "This ranch ran just fine before you showed up with your lists and your notions." "Did it?" Cora asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stovetop, its surface black and smooth from her care. She didn't raise it. She just held it, its weight a solid presence in her hand. "Did it run fine, Jed? Did the men enjoy their half-cooked beans and burnt coffee? Did the mare enjoy bleeding to death in the creek? Did Edna enjoy paying for tack that was rotting from neglect?" She took a step closer. The room was utterly still. "This ranch is bleeding out, from neglect, from laziness, from men who think their only job is to sit on a horse and who can't be bothered to carry a sack of flour 50 yards to feed the people who work alongside them." Jed's face went from red to a blotchy white. He was a big man, used to casual intimidation. But he was not used to this. He was not used to a woman who looked at him not with fear, but with a clear, cold assessment of his failings. He looked at the skillet in her hand, but then he looked at her eyes, and he knew the skillet was not the real weapon. The truth was the weapon. "Now, you can eat your soup without bread tonight," Cora said, her voice dropping back to its normal, calm register. "And tomorrow morning, before breakfast, you will bring me 2 sacks of flour from the barn. Or you can explain to Edna Garrett why her new cook, the one who is saving her $10 a week on wasted food alone, has nothing to bake with." She turned her back on him then, a dismissal more profound than any shout. She went back to the stove. Jed stood there for a long, humming moment, his fists clenched. The other men watched him, waiting. He could escalate. He could try to assert his physical dominance. But the moral high ground had been completely cut out from under him. He looked around the table and saw no support in the eyes of his men. He saw only a quiet waiting. With a curse under his breath, he yanked his chair out and sat down, grabbing his spoon with unnecessary force. He began to eat his soup, in silence. The door to the cookhouse opened, and Edna Garrett stepped inside. She had clearly been standing just outside, listening. Her face was, as usual, hard to read, but her eyes went from Jed's hunched shoulders to the skillet Cora had just placed back on the stove. She looked at Cora's straight back. She did not say a word about the confrontation. She simply walked to the table and sat in her usual spot. "Smells good, Cora," she said. Cora brought her a bowl of soup. As she set it down, Edna spoke again, her voice pitched just loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Jed, there's a loose board on the cookhouse porch. I want you to fix it, first thing in the morning, after you bring Cora her flour." It was a public declaration. A choice had been made. Jed's authority had been checked, and Cora's had been cemented. He didn't look up from his soup, but a dark flush crept up the back of his neck. Hap, the old-timer, picked up his spoon and resumed eating, a small, almost imperceptible nod, his only comment. The crisis had passed. Cora had not only weathered the internal resistance, she had defeated it with the simple, unassailable power of her own competence. The kitchen was her domain now, and everyone in the room knew it. Cora's trial week ended, and nothing was said. She just kept working, and Edna kept letting her. The arrangement solidified, unspoken, into permanence. The rhythm of the ranch changed. It was subtle, but profound. The work was still hard, the days long, but the grinding edge of desperation had been smoothed away. There was good food at the end of the day. There were mended shirts and socks. The cookhouse became the heart of the ranch, a warm, orderly space where the men could shed the dust and fatigue of their labor. Cora's influence, however, began to extend beyond the kitchen. She was by nature an organizer. She saw systems where others saw chaos. One rainy afternoon when outdoor work was impossible, she found Edna in the small cluttered room that served as the ranch office. Edna was hunched over a stack of papers, her face a mask of frustration. A ledger book lay open, a battlefield of scrawled numbers and crossed-out entries. "I can't make sense of it," Edna said, pushing a hand through her graying hair. "We should be doing better. The price of beef is up, but every month we're sinking deeper. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it." Cora stood in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. "Maybe I could take a look," she offered. "I kept the books on our farm." Edna looked up, skepticism warring with exhaustion. She had been carrying this burden alone for so long. The idea of sharing it was foreign. She remembered the clarity with which Cora had assessed the ranch's failings on her first day. She remembered the confrontation with Jed. This was not a woman who spoke without thinking. With a sigh of resignation, she pushed the ledger across the desk. "Be my guest. It's a rat's nest." It was worse than a rat's nest. The bookkeeping was a decade of hurried entries, missing receipts, and optimistic arithmetic. But Cora was patient. She lit a lamp against the gray afternoon and sat down. Samuel played quietly on the floor with his wooden animals, the soft scrape of wood on wood a calming counterpoint to the scratch of Cora's pen. She did not try to fix the old ledger. Instead, she started a new one. She took the jumbled piles of receipts for feed, for salt licks, for tools, and began to sort them, first by year, then by month. She worked for hours, her focus absolute. The rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof. Edna sat in a nearby chair, mending a bridle, pretending not to watch, but she watched every move. She watched the way Cora's brow furrowed in concentration, the neat columns of figures. She began to build on fresh paper, the way she would pause, close her eyes, and mentally tally a sum. It was late when Cora finally leaned back. "I think I found your hole," she said, her voice tired but clear. Edna put down her mending. "What is it?" "It's the feed supplier," Cora said, tapping a stack of receipts. "Mr. Abernathy in town." "Abernathy? We've been buying from him for 20 years. Mass! His father supplied my father." "I'm sure," Cora said. "And for the first 10 years of these receipts, his prices were fair. A little high, maybe, but fair for the distance. But about 10 years ago, right after your father passed, the prices started to creep up." She pushed a piece of paper toward Edna. It was a simple chart. On one side was the market price for oats and hay, which she'd found listed in old newspapers in the bottom of a crate. On the other side was what Abernathy had charged. The gap between the two lines grew wider with each passing year. "It's subtle," Cora explained. "A few cents on the pound here, $1 on the bale there. Never enough to make you stop and question it, especially when you're busy. But over 10 years, she pointed to a figure at the bottom of the page. "Over 10 years. You paid him almost $4,000 more than you should have." Edna stared at the number. $4,000. It was a staggering sum. It was the price of a new bull, of a new roof for the barn, of a dozen prime acres. It was the difference between sinking and swimming. That can't be right. "Here are the receipts," Cora said, her voice gentle. "And here are his own price lists from a few years back. I found them tucked into an old order book. They don't match what he billed you." She slid another set of papers over. The evidence was irrefutable. A cold fury began to build in Edna's chest. Abernathy was a pillar of the community. He served on the town council. He was also a close friend and hunting partner of Silas Blackwood, their neighbor to the east, a man whose ambition was matched only by his greed. Blackwood had been making offers on the Garrett Creek Ranch for years, low, insulting offers that Edna had always refused. "He's been bleeding me dry," Edna whispered, the words filled with a decade of frustration. "That snake." "He's been helping someone else bleed you," Cora corrected softly. "Who benefits the most if this ranch fails?" The implication hung in the air between them. Silas Blackwood. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation, enacted over years, with Abernathy as his tool. The plan was simple: weaken the ranch financially until Edna was forced to sell for a pittance. "What do we do?" Edna asked. The "we" was unconscious, but it was a sea change. It was the moment Cora's position shifted from employee to partner. Cora's mind was already working. This was not a problem to be solved with anger or accusation. That would lead to denials and a protracted, expensive legal fight they couldn't afford. It needed a different kind of solution. "You have a contract with him?" "Just a handshake." "An account." "Good," Cora said. "That makes it simpler." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with an idea. "The next time you go to town for supplies, you don't go to Abernathy. There's another feed and grain in Cottonwood, isn't there? It's a longer ride, but their prices are fair." I checked. "He'll know something's up. Let him," Cora said. "You don't say a word about what you found. You just take your business elsewhere. And when Abernathy comes asking why, and he will, you tell him you're cutting costs. Then you show him the price list from the Cottonwood supplier. Let him see that you know what a fair price is. You don't accuse him of theft. You just show him you're no longer a fool." It was a brilliant strategy. It avoided open conflict while sending a clear, undeniable message. It would force Abernathy's hand. He would either have to drastically lower his prices to compete, admitting his previous gouging, or lose their business entirely. Either way, the bleeding would stop. "And one more thing," Cora added, her voice dropping lower. She pushed another older-looking document across the desk. It was a brittle piece of paper from the original land grant file. "While I was looking for old invoices, I found this. It's the original survey. Look at the water rights for Garrett Creek. Edna squinted at the faded ink and the intricate spidery script. "It looks standard," she began, but Cora pointed to a specific clause. "It says here that the Garrett property holds senior rights to all water originating on this land, in perpetuity, for the purposes of agriculture and animal husbandry, regardless of subsequent downstream claims. Your father was a clever man. He made sure this ranch could never be choked off." Edna looked at Cora, a slow, dawning comprehension on her face. Silas Blackwood's ranch was downstream. For years he had been complaining about the water, making veiled threats about filing a legal challenge to divert more of the creek to his own property. It had been another source of constant, low-grade anxiety. "Keep this safe," Cora said, her hand resting on the document. "Don't mention it to anyone. An ace in the hole is only an ace, as long as the other players don't know you have it." That evening, after the work was done, Edna Garrett did something she hadn't done in years. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and simply talked. She told Cora about her husband, who had died in a riding accident 5 years after her father. She talked about the betrayals, the hired men who had stolen from her, the foreman who had tried to take advantage. She spoke of her weariness, of the crushing loneliness of being the sole person responsible for it all. Cora listened. She did not offer platitudes or easy sympathy. She just listened, her hands busy mending a shirt for Samuel, her presence a quiet, solid anchor in the warm room. When Edna finally fell silent, her story told, Cora looked up from her sewing. "You're not alone anymore," she said. It was a simple statement of fact, but for Edna Garrett, it felt like the first ray of sun after a decade of winter. The trust between them was no longer provisional. It had been forged in the quiet light of a lamp, over columns of figures, and the discovery of old secrets. Cora was no longer just the cook. She was the ranch's strategist, its memory, and its newfound hope. The first snows of winter came early that year, dusting the high peaks with white and bringing a sharp, clean bite to the air. On Cora's advice, Edna had shifted her business to the cottonwood supplier. The savings were immediate and substantial. Abernathy sent a letter, full of wounded pride and veiled questions, which Edna, following Cora's script, answered with a polite, businesslike letter, comparing prices. The exchange was clipped, but the financial hemorrhaging had stopped. For the first time in a long time, the ranch's ledger, now kept in Cora's immaculate hand, showed a thin but steady trickle of black ink instead of a flood of red. But Silas Blackwood was not a man to be thwarted so easily. The failure of his slow strangulation strategy only spurred him to more direct action. He saw the subtle but undeniable improvements at Garrett Creek, the mended fences, the healthier-looking cattle, the newfound purpose in the hands, and he knew his window of opportunity was closing. He knew the source of this new resilience was the quiet woman in the cookhouse. The threat, when it materialized, was not a natural disaster, but a man-made one, delivered on a sheet of crisp legal paper. A deputy sheriff rode out from town one afternoon in late October. Edna met him in the yard, her face grim. He handed her an injunction. It was a complex document, full of legal jargon, but the gist was brutally simple. Silas Blackwood was filing a formal claim on the water rights of Garrett Creek. He contended that the ranch's usage was excessive and was damaging his own downstream operations. A judge, a friend of Blackwood's, had granted a temporary order, effective immediately reducing the amount of water the Garrett Ranch could draw from the creek by half, pending a full hearing in the spring, by half. It was a death sentence. It wasn't enough to water the herd. It wasn't enough to sustain the winter hay crop they were trying to irrigate. It would force them to sell off cattle at a loss before the winter even set in, crippling them financially and ensuring that by spring they would be in no position to fight the claim. Blackwood had bypassed the slow bleed and gone straight for the jugular. "He can't do this," Edna said, her voice shaking with rage as she stared at the paper. "The water originates here." "He's got a judge in his pocket, ma'am," the deputy said, not unkindly. "He was just a messenger. The order is legal. You have to abide by it, or you'll be in contempt of court." The timing was malicious, calculated. A massive storm system was building in the north, a blue-black wall of clouds that promised to be the first big blizzard of the season. It was due to hit within 48 hours. The snows would make the mountain passes to Cottonwood and the county seat impassable for weeks, maybe months. Edna would have to travel immediately to file a counterclaim and present her evidence, the original land grant, to a circuit judge, a man known to be fair but who was 2 days' hard ride away. If she didn't, Blackwood's injunction would stand all winter. She was trapped. If she stayed, the ranch would wither. If she left to fight the injunction, she would be leaving the ranch vulnerable, with a skeleton crew, right as a major blizzard was about to hit. It was a perfect, vicious checkmate. "I have to go," Edna said, her decision made in an instant. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "He's banking on me being trapped here. I won't let him win." Panic began to set in among the men. Jed, though his respect for Cora had grown, was a follower, not a leader, in a crisis of this magnitude. Leo was too young. Hap was too old. They looked to Edna, and they saw her preparing to leave. That evening, the ranch was a hive of frantic activity. Edna packed her saddlebags, her movements jerky with anger and anxiety. She gave Jed a rapid-fire list of instructions for battening down the ranch, for protecting the herd. The wind was already picking up, moaning through the eaves of the barn, carrying the scent of snow. The temperature was dropping fast. Edna found Cora in the cookhouse, where she was calmly packing tins with biscuits, dried beef, and coffee, provisions for Edna's journey. There was no panic in her movements. "You'll be in charge," Edna said, the words coming out in a rush. "Cora, listen to me. The men will listen to you now. Jed respects you, even if you won't admit it. Just hold things together. Keep the cattle in the south pasture. It's more sheltered. Ration the hay. Don't let the pipes freeze." She was faltering, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Leaving her ranch at a time like this felt like abandoning a child in a fire. Cora placed a hand on Edna's arm. Her touch was steady. "You go and fight the legal battle," she said. "We'll fight the winter here. Take the land grant." She handed the precious, brittle document to Edna, now wrapped in oilcloth. "And take this." She pressed a small, heavy pouch into Edna's other hand. It was filled with coins. "It's what I have left. For a lawyer if you need one." Edna stared at the pouch, then at Cora's face. "I can't take your money." "This is my home now, too," Cora said simply. "We're fighting for the same thing." At dawn the next morning, Edna rode out, a lone figure against a bruised and lowering sky. She did not look back. The moment her horse disappeared over the ridge, a profound and heavy silence fell over the ranch. The wind howled, and the first hard, stinging pellets of snow began to fall. The power vacuum was absolute. Edna was gone, the storm was here, and Silas Blackwood was waiting like a vulture for them to fail. The men gathered in the yard, huddled against the wind, their faces uncertain. They looked from the empty road to the darkening sky. They looked at Jed, who was staring at the barn as if hoping instructions would magically appear on the weathered wood. They were good men, good hands, but they were adrift. Cora stepped out of the cookhouse. She had a heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was not carrying a weapon or a tool. She simply stood on the porch, letting the wind whip strands of hair across her face, and waited. When all eyes were on her, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." It was not a request. It was a statement of intent. The uncertainty in the yard did not vanish, but it found a direction. Cora did not wait for permission or consensus. She took charge. Her authority came not from a title, but from the simple, overwhelming fact that she was the only one who knew exactly what needed to be done. "Leo," she commanded, "you and Hap start with the water troughs. Break the ice and fill them to the brim. Once the storm hits hard, we won't be able to get to the pump. Then I want every barrel, every bucket, every pot and pan we have filled with water and stored in the cookhouse in the barn. Jed," she continued, turning to the foreman, "the herd, we're not leaving them in the south pasture. That blizzard is coming from the north. The wind will drive them right into the fences. We're bringing them into the main corral right here. It's smaller, but it's sheltered on 3 sides by the buildings. We can keep an eye on them. Jed opened his mouth to argue. It was unconventional, but he saw the logic in it instantly. He had been about to follow Edna's orders blindly, but Cora had analyzed the situation and found a better solution. He shut his mouth and nodded, a short, sharp jerk of his head. "The 2 new hands," Cora said, pointing to the men who had been hired on for the autumn roundup. "You're with Jed. Move the cattle and bring in the mare from the small paddock. I want her in a warm stall, Samuel," she called to her son who was watching from the doorway. "You're in charge of the kindling. I want the wood box by the stove filled to the top. Can you do that?" The boy nodded solemnly and set to his task. Cora herself moved with a calm, relentless energy. She organized the response, not like a foreman shouting orders, but like a general deploying troops. Her decisions were strategic, intelligent, and focused on the collective good. She directed the men to stack bales of hay as windbreaks against the northern walls of the barn and house. She had them check the latches on every door and shutter. Inside the cookhouse, she began preparing for a siege. She baked all the remaining flour into dense, long-lasting loaves of bread. She put on a massive pot of stew, enough to feed them for 2 days. The cookhouse was no longer just a kitchen. It was the command center. The storm hit with the fury of a physical blow. The world outside the windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The wind screamed, a living thing trying to tear the buildings from their foundations. The temperature plummeted. It was impossible to see more than a few feet. The ranch was an island in a sea of frozen chaos. For 2 days they were locked in a battle with the elements. The men worked in short, brutal shifts, their faces covered in ice, to keep the cattle from panicking and to ensure they had water and feed. Inside, Cora kept the fires roaring. Hot food and coffee, always ready for the freezing men when they stumbled back inside. She moved through the crisis with an unnerving calm, her presence a steadying force against the storm's rage and the men's fear. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind died down. The snow stopped. A strange, luminous silence fell over the world. The sun rose on a landscape transformed, buried under 4 feet of pristine blue-white snow. The ranch had survived. The cattle were safe, if restless. The men were exhausted, but they were whole. They had held on, but the true crisis had not been the storm. As Leo was clearing a path from the house to the barn, he saw it first. A dark shape, moving slowly through the drifts, coming up the main road. It was a sleigh. In it were 2 men, Silas Blackwood and the town sheriff. Blackwood had come to see his victory. He had timed it perfectly. He knew the storm would have stretched them to the breaking point. He knew Edna was gone. He had come with the sheriff to enforce the injunction, to witness their failure, and to make his final, non-negotiable offer on the ruined ranch. His face, when he stepped out of the sleigh, was a mask of false concern. "Sheriff, I was worried sick about these folks," he said, his voice booming in the still air. "With Edna gone and this storm, it's a miracle they're still standing." The men gathered in the yard, shovels and pitchforks in hand. They were tired and dirty, and they looked at Blackwood with open hostility. Jed stepped forward, his expression grim. "We're fine, Blackwood. No thanks to you." Blackwood ignored him, his eyes scanning the ranch. He saw the cattle penned in the corral, not scattered and frozen in the pastures. He saw the smoke rising steadily from 2 chimneys. He saw order, not chaos. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "Well, I'm glad to see it," he said smoothly. "But business is business, Sheriff. You're here to witness that the injunction is being followed. Half the water. That's the order. We'll just check the sluice gate." This was the moment. This was the final turn of the screw. With the herd penned so close, their water needs were immense. Enforcing the injunction now would be catastrophic. Just then, the door of the cookhouse opened. Cora stepped out onto the porch. She was holding a tin coffee pot. Samuel stood just behind her in the doorway. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." "Sheriff," she said, her voice calm and clear, "would you care for some coffee? It's a cold morning for business." Blackwood looked at her, a dismissive smirk on his face. "I'm not here for coffee, ma'am." "Ah." "I'm here to ensure the law is being followed." "Of course," Cora said. She came down the steps, moving through the snow with a steady grace. She walked right past the armed sheriff and the glowering ranch hands and stopped in front of Silas Blackwood. The law is a funny thing, isn't it? So many little details to keep track of. She looked him directly in the eye. "For example," she said, her voice dropping slightly, but still audible to everyone in the yard, "the law is very particular about mail fraud, especially when it involves federal mail routes, and a pattern of deliberate overcharging over the course of a decade. The kind of thing that could put a man, say, a feed supplier, in a federal prison for a very long time, especially if there was proof that a prominent citizen was benefiting from that fraud and encouraging it." The smirk on Blackwood's face froze. His eyes narrowed. He had no idea how she could know about Abernathy, but he saw from her expression that she did. "I don't know what you're talking about," he blustered. "Don't you?" Cora continued, her voice relentlessly pleasant. "And it's also very particular about land grants, especially senior water rights established at the founding of the county and recorded in the Federal Registrar. The kind of rights that make any downstream claim and any injunction based on such a claim completely fraudulent." She took a small step closer. "Edna has gone to file that grant with the circuit judge, but she left me with copies of Mr. Abernathy's invoices and a very detailed letter for the U.S. Marshal outlining his business practices and your long and profitable friendship." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Now, the passes are snowed in. The telegraph lines are down. No one is getting in or out of this valley for at least a week, which means you and the sheriff here are the only law in town." She looked from Blackwood's pale face to the sheriff, who was now looking deeply uncomfortable. "So you have a choice, Mr. Blackwood. You can enforce your illegal injunction. And when the snow's clear, you can explain to a federal marshal and a circuit judge why you conspired to defraud this ranch and perjured yourself in court. Or you can have a cup of coffee, admit you were mistaken about the water, and ride home. And we'll consider the matter of the fraudulent invoices a simple 10-year-long accounting error, one that is now corrected. It was not a threat of violence. It was a perfectly executed checkmate. She had laid out his crimes, presented him with the evidence, and offered him one, and only one, path of retreat that didn't lead to his utter ruin. She had used his own isolation against him. He was trapped here with his crimes, exposed. Silas Blackwood stared at her, his face a storm of fury, humiliation, and disbelief. He had been beaten, not by a man with a gun, not by a lawyer in a courtroom, but by a quiet woman with a coffee pot. Standing in the snow, armed only with facts, he looked around the yard. He saw the faces of the ranch hands, Jed and Hap and Leo, watching him not with fear, but with a hard-earned contempt. He saw the sheriff, deliberately looking away, wanting no part of this. His power, which had been built on bluster and intimidation, had evaporated in the cold morning air. Without another word, he turned, strode back to his sleigh, and climbed in. "Let's go," he snarled at the sheriff. The sleigh turned and began its slow, ignominious retreat down the road. The men in the yard stood in stunned silence, watching it disappear. Then slowly, they all turned to look at Cora. She hadn't moved. She still held the coffee pot. She had faced down the wolf at their door and sent him slinking away with his tail between his legs. Leo was the first to break the silence. A slow grin spread across his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of wonder, "I do believe. I'd love a cup of that coffee." A ragged cheer went up from the other men. Jed just shook his head, a look of grudging, profound respect on his face. He walked over to Cora, took the coffee pot from her hand. "I'll pour," he said. It was an act of surrender and an oath of fealty. The victory was complete. A week later, the passes cleared enough for a rider to get through. Edna Garrett returned, her horse tired but her eyes blazing with triumph. The circuit judge had not only accepted her claim but had issued a permanent, binding ruling affirming the Garrett Ranch's senior water rights, and he had sent a scathing letter to the local judge who had issued Blackwood's injunction. The legal battle was over. She rode into a ranch that was not just surviving but thriving. The men worked with a new energy, a new pride. The yard was clear of snow, the cattle were healthy, and the entire operation hummed with a quiet efficiency she had only ever dreamed of. Hap and Leo met her in the yard, their stories of the storm and Blackwood's visit tumbling out. They told her how Cora had taken charge, how she had outthought the storm, how she had faced down Blackwood with nothing but information and nerve. Edna found Cora where she always found her, in the cookhouse. The room was warm and smelled of baking bread. Samuel was at the table, carefully drawing a picture of the ranch on a piece of butcher paper. He looked up when Edna entered, and for the first time he spoke to her. "Edna," he said, a clear, simple word. Then he went back to his drawing. Edna's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Cora, who was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour. There were 100 things to say, 100 thanks to give, but the words felt too small. She sat down at the table, weary to her bones, but filled with a profound sense of peace. "He called me Edna," she said quietly. "He's been talking more," Cora said. She did not stop working the dough. "He feels safe here." The two women sat in a comfortable silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle thump of Cora's hands on the dough. Finally, Edna spoke. "I went to town to hire a hand that day you arrived," Edna said, looking at her own calloused fingers. "A man I thought I could trust to be a new foreman. He never showed up. I thought it was a sign of more bad luck. I thought this place was finished." She looked up, and her eyes, usually so guarded, were clear and direct. "I was wrong. It wasn't bad luck. It was the best luck this ranch has ever had." She pushed a folded legal document across the table. It was not the judge's ruling. It was something new, drawn up by the lawyer in the county seat. "I hired a cook," Edna said, her voice thick with emotion. "I offered you a roof and meals for you and your boy. It's not enough. It's not nearly enough." Cora wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the paper. She unfolded it. It was a deed of partnership. It gave her a full, legal 49% share in the Garrett Creek Ranch. Not as a wage, not as a gift. As a partner. "A ranch needs a head," Edna continued softly. "Someone to make the hard decisions, to face the world. That's me. But it also needs a heart. Someone to make it a home, to keep it running, to see the things no one else sees, to be its strength when the head is gone." She looked at Cora, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "That's you. This paper just makes it official." Cora read the document. She saw the careful language, the binding clauses. It was a permanent offer. An anchor. A home. She thought of her rival, a desperate woman with 2 bags and a silent son, with nothing to offer but the work of her hands and the contents of her mind. She had come here asking for shelter. She was being offered a future. She looked up from the paper at Edna's hopeful, tired face. She looked at her son, who was now humming to himself as he drew. She looked around the warm, clean kitchen that she had built from a ruin. She had not come here seeking a partnership. She had not come here seeking a fortune. She had come here seeking a place to stand, and in the process, she had saved the ground beneath all their feet. She folded the paper neatly and placed it on the table. She picked up her ball of dough and, with a firm, practiced motion, placed it in a greased bowl to rise. "The bread will be ready in an hour," Cora said. She looked at Edna, and her own smile was a mirror of the other woman's partner. Music. The last light of evening cast a golden glow across the valley. From the porch of the main house, 2 women watched the cattle settling in for the night. The air was cold and clean, full of the promise of a hard but honest winter. A lamp glowed in the window of the cookhouse, a warm, yellow square against the deepening twilight. Inside, a little boy sat at a long table, his voice a low murmur as he told a story to an audience of small, carved wooden animals. The scent of fresh bread hung in the air, a quiet testament to the day's labor. Garrett Creek had been a place of survival, a piece of land held by a thread. It had needed a strong back and a sharp mind. It had needed a steady hand and an unbreakable will. What it got was Cora Halloran. What it got was the woman who made it a home.